Hello and welcome to Fireside Chats with me, Dr. Peters. I was born and raised in New Hampshire and I completed my PhD at the University of Glasgow. My research focuses on the intellectual history of the US Constitution, on how that history, philosophy, political theory, and constitutional law can help us better understand and address our contemporary social and political issues. Now, today what I'd like to chat about is how we got here, how we got into this mess, this crisis of democracy, of polarization, and epistemology or propaganda. We're currently living in a society where people on different sides of the political aisle see each other as enemies and potentially existential threats. We have a political world where people don't know what's true and what's false, and different groups look to different sources and different authorities to determine what is true and what isn't. And all the while, more and more of us are losing trust in our governments, to say the least, but also in the ideal of democracy. It's not working. Now, what raises this topic is not one individual news story, but the crescendo of unprecedented events that keep occurring, that we're inundated with and leave us all feeling overwhelmed. It feels like there's too much to keep track of and too much to deal with. So today, through discussing how we got here, the underlying causes and the relationship between those causes provides a framework through which you can better understand and manage what you're seeing in the news and the world around you, and hopefully better respond to it. What will also become apparent is that going back to the status quo is not a possibility or not a meaningful one, because it's that status quo that got us into this mess in the first place. The current president and administration are symptoms, they're not a cause. So to get to a functioning democracy requires something more. Now, to help understand how we got here and to put forward this framework for understanding the madness that we're inundated with every day, I'm going to use James Wilson's model of democracy, which should come as no surprise to regular viewers of this channel. As I've mentioned before, Wilson is one of our founders, and his model of democracy, at least to me, makes a lot of sense. Now, what it proposes is that society, knowledge, and government or democracy are all interrelated, and they create a feedback loop, a positive progressive feedback loop, where one feeds into the next. This model is based on the philosophy of his fellow Scot Thomas Reid, who recognized a reciprocal relationship between society and knowledge, where improvements in society lead to improvements in knowledge and vice versa. Wilson and Reid see knowledge as a product of society or emerging out of society, that it's through our discussions, discourses, and disagreements that human beings create and develop knowledge, not to mention our ability to pass on that knowledge and wisdom to future generations, who in turn can further develop, improve, and even correct that knowledge, which sounds a little bit like our founders' hopes and ideals for what we would do with the foundation, the knowledge, the US Constitution that they left us. Now, according to Wilson, this social development of knowledge is what allowed human beings to survive and become the dominant species on this planet, because that knowledge improves our lives and improves our society. That's that reciprocal relationship. We can think of this in terms of developments in technology, medicine, when to plant crops, and we can even think of it in terms of something as simple as an axe. Our ancestors started out with a rock. Some guy added a handle to it, a little bit more leverage. And then we developed metallurgy and we went through different materials. Eventually, we've arrived at a high carbon steel axe. It's a very simple tool that you can get at the hardware store, but it took thousands of years and potentially thousands of people to develop the knowledge necessary to create a high carbon steel axe. Now, what Wilson thinks is the pinnacle of humanity's inventions is government. Wilson believed that human beings invented government as a means to protect and improve the societies that they had. They could better collaborate and cooperate and enforce justice and create rules and norms that allow for a more harmonious interaction between larger and larger groups of people. This is the point of government, the point of laws, according to Wilson at least. On this original purpose for government, the protection and improvement of society or the social life, according to Wilson, remains the chief end of government, what it should be aimed at. That's their job. And democratic governance, particularly, is such a wonderful invention because it directly engages with this reciprocal relationship between society and knowledge that makes humanity humanity and the dominant species on the planet. It does so because its aim is to protect and improve society. And because it's a democracy, and particularly in Wilson's revolutionary conception of democracy, the people can improve government, their tool for protecting and improving society. So government protects and improves society. Society then develops more knowledge because it's been improved and comes up with new ideas. And then it can use that knowledge to improve the government, which leads to more improvements in society. And the cycle continues. We get this positive feedback loop and this synergistic relationship. This sounds wonderful and idealistic. However, today we're going to focus on how this model helps us understand the interrelated nature of all of these crises that we're experiencing right now. Essentially, what this model suggests is that these crises are creating a negative feedback loop, that it's going in the opposite direction. Now, if we look at our crises, they align with these key nodes in Wilson's model of democracy. We have effective political polarization, which is where the two sides of politics see their opponents as not the loyal opposition, but as enemies and potentially an existential threat. This is a breaking of society. We also live in a world inundated by propaganda where different groups are looking to different sources and authorities to understand the world around them, meaning that they have completely different epistemological frameworks and views of the world. And so this breaks our ability to collectively develop knowledge because we can no longer meaningfully communicate. And if we can no longer meaningfully communicate and see other people in society as enemies, how can we ever collectively decide on things or compromise? And so have a functioning democracy, because democracy requires that we formulate collective decisions, goals, and we compromise with one another to live in a common society. And thus, if democracy no longer functions, it falls into what's known as a legitimacy crisis. People no longer see democracy as legitimate. And it begins with not seeing their own government as legitimate and can quickly devolve into giving up on the ideal of democracy. Now, Wilson's model also suggests that these are all interrelated. And on a theoretical level, we can see this. So if you have a fracture in society that different groups of society are no longer interacting with one another, we can see where the possibility for diverging epistemological frameworks can come to grow up within these cracks. If we're not talking with each other, our worldviews might not align. We can't correct one another and point out weaknesses, errors, and flaws, or news that maybe the other person's source and authority aren't reporting on. And again, this inability to communicate completely undermines the ability for democracy to function. We have to be able to talk to make democracy work. Now, what further inhibits democracy is social division. If compromise becomes treason or betrayal, then democracy becomes gridlocked and it can't function. Now, importantly, when democracy fails to function, when it becomes gridlocked and can no longer fulfill its chief end of protecting and improving society, all of a sudden, society begins to degrade. The economy goes down. People's future prospects become insecure and dark. People are scared. People are angry. And in such a situation, people become more tribal. The polarization becomes more effective. It becomes more militant. And angry and scared people are more easily manipulated and susceptible to propaganda. And with this, we have the formation of a tribal epistemology. And this is where people believe something because it allows them to identify with the group. And because they identify with the group, they believe certain things. Belief becomes about group identity. And when you have multiple tribal epistemologies, you have what I call a socio-epistemological rupture, where people are not divided by politics, but they're divided by tribe and tribal epistemology. And such disorientation and division allows for corruption to come in. And this corruption normally feeds on the fear and anger of the people in these tribal epistemologies, because angry and scared people vote and click. And so making them angrier and more scared is an easy way to gain power and support as well as money. And in such a situation, reforming our institutions become impossible because of the distrust between groups of people. Any proposed reform, no matter how good, is going to appear to be an attempt to rig the system in the favor of one's own team. And as things get worse, normally a great leader rises who promises to fix everything, to take care of those corrupt elites, to reform the government and make it work again, to restore the nation to its former glory, to make it great again. Now, normally, this great leader will identify the opposition and a certain group as the root of the country's problems. They are the enemy. They're leaning into this tribalism and tribal epistemology. And this is where they gain their power and rise to positions of leadership. And all that they require in return is normally a little bit of grift and money, but also for the people to give up their power, to give up their voice, to give up their democracy. The country is experiencing an existential threat, right? And democracy hasn't really been working, so there's not much to lose, is there? And so we can see this negative feedback loop spiraling downward. More tribalism and tribal epistemology, this socio-epistemological rupture fed on by corruption and exacerbated by failures of the government to protect and improve society, create a downward spiral where worse social conditions lead to more tribalism and more susceptibility to propaganda, and thus deeper and more constrained tribal epistemologies. And in turn, these tribal epistemologies, this socio-epistemological rupture, make democratic governance nearly impossible. And thus, people lose trust in it and the very ideal of democracy. This theoretical framework is by no means the complete story. It doesn't even include all of my research. However, I think it's helpful for helping us understand the different mechanisms at play that lead to the world that we see around us. And I think adding to this theoretical framework, the historical context that got us to this point will help us better understand how we got here, why it looks like it does, and thus how we can respond to it. Again, the history I'm about to give you is by no means complete, but it'll give you an idea of what this looks like in reality. And it will also help us see that the current president and administration are symptoms, not the root cause. And so if we want to respond to these crises, it means more than just impeaching someone or removing them with the 25th Amendment, or even voting differently. Although all those things are good things, in my opinion, and will help. So to begin, American culture is inherently fragile and has been since the founding. In part, that's because Lockean political thought pervades how most of us see politics in the world. Many of our founders adhered to Locke's political thought, and it became part of our culture. So whether we realize it or not, many of us think in Lockean terms, and we can see this in ideas like rugged individualism and our focus on property rights. And while Locke does present some good and interesting ideas that were a huge leap forward at the time towards more liberty and more justice, there were also massive holes. One of those is a failure to recognize the importance of society and the social development of knowledge. Locke's philosophy is hyper-individualistic, as we discussed in an earlier chat. And because of that, any society built on a Lockean foundation is inherently fragile and prone to atomization. And we can see this fracturing in the 1960s and 70s with the rise of counterculture and the New Left, and the right responding in the rise of neoconservatism. Now, neoconservatism was trying to go back to what they argued was the American hegemonic culture after World War II. Now, historians debate whether this American culture actually existed, but that was their goal. And they said that there were certain principles that were inherently American. And these positions were arguments on big government and what we call today the welfare state or FDR's New Deal. They're trying to roll back these reforms. And what they're arguing for is harsher criminal punishments and free market capitalism. Now, what the neoconservatives also do is they plant the seeds of a tribal epistemology to justify their positions and say that they're American. They adapt and reshape Scottish Enlightenment moral philosophy, or more accurately, they bastardize it. What they use it to argue is that we don't need experts, academics, journalists, government officials to tell us what's true or false about politics, that all we need is our inherent moral sense, or more accurately, the inherent moral sense of real Americans, to tell us how to vote and what we should do as a community as it concerns political choices and policies. Now, often the neoconservatives told the real Americans what their moral sense should be saying. They would argue that there was a consensus among real Americans that they agreed with the neoconservatives' positions. And so we have people who want to be considered real Americans believing that their moral sense tells them that they should be for free market capitalism and against the welfare state because they want to belong and be a real American. And so we have belonging informing belief. And also importantly, it means that people who hold other political positions, and particularly those leftist academic elites and journalists, are un-American and thus untrustworthy. And so what they're doing is they're disregarding the institutions and the people that historically have been the keepers of our shared epistemological framework as un-American and biased, and replacing it with their consensus of real Americans' moral sense as an alternative. We have this epistemological breach growing out of the social division of the 1960s and 70s. And along with this division, we get the rise of right-wing media. If journalists and academics are biased, we need our own media to stay informed and, tell us what this consensus is that we're supposed to believe so that we can belong and be called real Americans. Now, this epistemological framework becomes further filled out with originalism. Now, this is a method of constitutional interpretation that's used in the Supreme Court, and it was introduced in the 1980s by Ronald Reagan's administration. So, originalism arguably doesn't go back to the origin, the founding. But originalism argues that we should interpret the U.S. Constitution in terms of the original intent of the people who wrote it. Well, and then it changed to the people who ratify it, and then it changed to an objective 18th century observer. Now, some of you might be surprised by my pushback against originalism, given that I talk about the founders so often. However, this deserves its own chat, and don't worry about the details. When this methodology seeped into popular culture, it became a mythical past and golden age that was used to define not only what was constitutional and unconstitutional, but now what was American and what was un-American, both in politics and culture. And this is where we get ideas about the founders' intent concerning not only different bills and policies and laws, but also about what it means to be American. Whether it has to do with your gender identity or your sexual orientation or what color your skin is. Now, this socio-epistemological rupture coming out of the 60s, 70s, and 80s comes to a head in the 1980s and 90s in what's called the culture wars. Think Newt Gingrich. And this is defined as the battle over Americanness. What defines us as Americans, both in culture and in politics? Now, we have the right arguing from these neoconservative and originalist principles and within this epistemology, and they're asserting that Academics, journalists, people on the left generally are un-American and hold un-American positions. Now, many on the left capitulated this battle in many ways. Many of them were social reformers, and they were trying to correct the baked in mistakes and errors in the US Constitution and others that intervening generations had made along the way. They were trying to make a more just and equal society, which I would argue aligns with Americanness. However, those on the right did not agree. And people on the left said, if those errors and mistakes are what define Americanness, sure, we're un-American. Now, in 2008, a bunch of gasoline is dumped on this socio-epistemological rupture, or dumpster fire if you prefer. Makes the analogy work better, doesn't it? What happens is not only do we have a cultural fracture in society, society is actually degraded with this economic downturn, the Great Recession, the 2008 global financial crisis. People are worse off. And when people are worse off, they circle the wagons to protect their own group. They become more tribal. And so these tribal epistemologies deepen because angry and scared people are more easily manipulated by propaganda. Moreover, government fails to adequately respond to this crisis. We see bankers and CEOs getting bailed out, while normal people are left holding the bag. This creates greater distrust in government and begins this legitimacy crisis of, can we trust the government? Is it actually working? Now, because of the deepening of these tribal epistemologies, there's gridlock in the government and nothing gets done. This is the time where we see Mitch McConnell's Grim Reaper speech, where he says his job as Senate Majority Leader is to make sure nothing the Obama administration wants makes it through the Senate or even makes it to the floor. Because at this point, compromising with the other side is akin to betrayal or treason. This is where the Tea Party movement begins. And they align with the neoconservative and originalist principles and synthesize them together. They're for limited government. They're against collectivist action, or what we might call social programs, helping our fellow members of our community with things like SNAP and welfare and Social Security. And they present their goal as returning to the mythic golden age of the founding. So they're on board with this originalism ideology at this point. I mean, look at the name. It's the Tea Party. They're harking back to the Boston Tea Party. And moreover, part of that idea of the mythic founding is that we are a republic as opposed to a democracy. So they're arguing for less say in how our government is run. Again, hoping to force us back into an 18th century understanding of politics and society. Now, that transforms the distrust and frustration with government and democracy into what's approaching an anti-democratic position. So we see the legitimacy crisis deepening with the institution of this Tea Party ideology. And we also see the political polarization become more effective, which means more militant, essentially, and more dehumanizing to their opponents. So while the neoconservatives saw their opponents, the traditional keepers of our epistemological framework, as un-American, the Tea Party rejected academics, journalists, government officials, the media, anyone who disagreed with them as not only un-American, but akin to a foreign invasion, trying to destroy the United States with their foreign ideas and their foreign propaganda. This terminology of an enemy and an existential threat begins to rise in our society. And this gridlocks democracy. This is really where compromise and bipartisanship dies, because it becomes treason. You're working with the foreign invaders? Now, by no means was this the entire right, but it was a strong enough part of the right to effectively gridlock our democracy. And in this disorientation and distrust, corruption was allowed to rise. Politicians and business people realized that they could gain power and money from making people angrier and more scared. Angry and scared people vote and click on articles. And this only got worse with the arrival and popularity of social media and algorithms that manage where we go and what we see. This further reinforced those tribal epistemologies. Now, all we're seeing is people who agree with us that reinforce those tribal identities and that tribal epistemology. And we only see a few people that make us really, really angry. And so we click and we engage. And then we go out to vote for the person who promises that they'll deal with that invasion. And because that is so powerful, politicians and platforms lean into it and select for it. And this further grows the socio-epistemological rupture. And that corruption was made even easier through the passage of the Citizens United opinion in 2010, which essentially legalized bribery, further corrupting the government and making it even more dysfunctional and less responsive to the people. People got more frustrated, they got angrier, they felt betrayed by the representatives and betrayed by their government. Trust falls, the legitimacy crisis deepens. And at this point, our current president enters as a savior, as the great leader who's going to fix all of this. He's going to drain the swamp, get rid of the corruption, those representatives, that government that had betrayed the people. And he's going to return it to the mythical golden age. He's going to make America great again. And he's going to do this in part by dealing with the real problem, the invasion of un-American leftist academics and journalists and actual foreign immigrants that he's identified as the root of America's problems. And if they're taken care of, everything will go back to the way it was. We'll return to that mythic golden age, because it's these un-American people voting and being involved in our democracy that's gridlocked it and broken it. And of course, to accomplish this will require, breaking a few eggs, or the US Constitution and our democratic norms. But it's justified, right? Because there's an invasion. And you know what? Democracy hasn't really been working that well, so losing it, not a big deal. Maybe a dictator for a day is what we need. And moreover, as the person who shapes and forms the tribal epistemology, this great leader, the president, has huge control over not only what his followers see, but how they interpret it. This is where we get the ideas about playing 4D chess, and it's not really against the Constitution. And we see him leaning into this power, this tribal epistemology. In his first term, we got introduced to alternative facts. We got to see journalists and academics be called enemies of the state. Immigrants were repressed and oppressed, with families being separated at the border, children being put in cages. And it's all only gotten worse since then, in part because this administration is desperately trying to hold on to power as it all falls apart. And part of that has been the intentional undermining of the legitimacy of our democracy through ideas that our elections really aren't fair anymore. So if I lose, I didn't really lose. The election was stolen from me. This directly contributes to and actively tries to deepen the already existing legitimacy crisis, which people are prepared to believe because their government hasn't been working for them. And they're primed as part of this tribal epistemology to believe the current president as an authority. And so it's no surprise that on January 6th, we have people participating in an attempted self-coup carrying Revolutionary War era flags, believing that they're saving the republic from a free and fair election. Because un-American people, that foreign invasion, that existential threat, must have been allowed to vote. And it's them being in our government and our society that is keeping us from being great again. And this is what makes it so confusing, is that all these crises are interrelated and exacerbated by corruption and feed into each other. We see society falling, which pushes people further into tribalism and tribal epistemology, which makes democracy even more dysfunctional, which lowers our trust in it, which makes it less able to protect and improve our society, continuing the cycle downward. Now, that's a pretty dark outlook, but I don't think it's impossible to overcome. We're seeing progress, and I think seeing it clearly can help us respond better to it. Because I'm sure many of you have never heard something like a socio-epistemological rupture, and understanding this problem in these terms can help us better respond to it. For instance, if this Wilsonian diagnosis is right, it means to respond to this, we need to focus on strengthening our society, not only with people within our tribe, but beyond our tribe. We need to work to create a unified society again. That doesn't mean we agree on everything, but we can learn to trust each other again. We need to come together and start to form a collective epistemological framework again, where we agree on simple things like reality and what laws mean. And we need to double down on democracy by participating more fully in it. And I see people all throughout the United States starting to do these things, working to strengthen their communities and reaching out to people and welcoming people who are on the other side back into community. And I've also seen many Americans educating themselves not only on what's going on in the world, but how to be more discerning consumers and distributors of news. People are more often thinking twice before they simply repost something. They're looking at who they're listening to and why, and questioning not only people on the other side, but people on their own side. We saw the left go after one of their own over sexual harassment charges, but we've also seen the right start to question the current president and even the attempted assassination recently. So we're starting to see a breakdown in tribal epistemology. The control is no longer as complete, especially underneath the president, as the different wings of that coalition start to fracture. And we see more and more people going out and participating in democracy by protesting, by volunteering at polls, by writing congressmen and women, by getting involved in local government. And that's how we take back democracy, is we do the hard work of advanced citizenship and we get involved. And where these three crises converge, as well as the solutions, is over that culture wars question of Americanness. And I think that's at the heart of how we come out of these intertwined crises, is we come together and we collectively formulate an idea of Americanness and the principles and values that underpin that, that we can reunite around as a society and develop a shared epistemological framework around those foundational principles and values. And through that, a functioning democracy where we can again have the loyal opposition, where both sides are working to realize those principles and values and might disagree on which ones to prioritize and how to realize them. That's how a democracy is supposed to work, where all Americans trying to realize the common good of our society and our country. And this is a discussion that everybody has to be involved in. And I see it starting to happen. I see it in the American flags at No Kings protests. I see it in progressive politicians who are reclaiming the term American and getting involved in the defining of that term. And I see it in our servicemen and women who are refusing to fight in order to defend and protect the US Constitution. They're saying this is un-American and I will not participate in it. So in these ways, we see the country coming together to have this conversation. And that gives me hope. And I think the American people are up to that very difficult task. And it is difficult because there are all of these moving parts. However, I think in being able to see those different anchoring points of what they're rotating around, instead of being overwhelmed by the news that's coming in, we can say, oh, this is the epistemology crisis. This is effective polarization. This is the legitimacy crisis. And so instead of dealing with 100 new news stories, we're dealing with largely the same 3 to 6 problems. And I hope that helps us be less overwhelmed and respond better. But it is crucial that we respond, that we take up the mantle of advanced citizenship and engage with our democracy. To engage in that discussion about what we want America and Americanness to stand for. That's why I come back to that at the end of every one of these chats, because it is that important. It is at the heart, because that process alone will help bring us back together and give us the power to hold our leaders accountable and reclaim our democracy. For now, I'll leave you to ponder that. As always, thank you so much for watching. I hope you found it interesting and educational. I'm sorry it's so long, but this one's a bit of a complicated topic. If you want more content like this, you can look at my YouTube and Substack channel. You can also find the different chats that I've referenced in the description below. And if you want to hear more of this kind of content moving forward, feel free to like and subscribe. And please do feel free to ask questions and leave comments. Those in the subscriptions really help me get these ideas and messages out to more people, and I'd like to think they'd help. So I appreciate all of you who do comment regularly and like the videos. It means a lot to me. It keeps me encouraged. And again, it helps get these ideas out to more people so more of us can get involved in this discussion about what we want America and Americanness to stand for. So with that, thanks again for watching, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.